Carrying on with our series of podcasts on immunity, we're now going to look at the role that various cells play in innate immunity. Now, these are the white blood cells, and it's well known that white blood cells are vital to protect the body against infection. If there's a deficiency in white blood cells, then the individual becomes much more prone to developing infections. And if someone has an infection, then the body produces more white blood cells to try and compensate for that infection. They develop what's called a leukocytosis. Now, a leukocyte is a white blood cell. Leuc means white. So the term leukocytes and white blood cell are interchangeable. But there are different types of leukocyte involved in innate immunity. Now, the first type we're going to talk about are the granular sites. Now, the granular sites are the white blood cells that end in -phil. So there's basophils, neutrophils, and eosinophils. And in terms of innate immunity, neutrophils are involved in the process of phagocytosis. They are active phagocytic cells. They're relatively small, so they're sometimes referred to as macrophages, small cells that eat, small eating cells. So neutrophils are phagocytic. They can phagocytose antigenic organisms invading bacteria or viruses. If you don't know what phagocytosis means, just hang on, we're going to do that in a little while. Now, the other sort of granular sites that take part in innate immunity are the eosinophils. Now, normally there's very few eosinophils in the blood, but if there's a parasitic infection of the larger parasites like gastrointestinal worms or tissue worms, infections that very often are associated with warmer countries, tropical infections, but you can get it in temperate climates as well. Multicellular parasitic organisms that can infect the body. Well, eosinophils are very active against these. And what the eosinophils do is they actually come up next to the parasite and they drop a chemical on it called perforin. And this perforin will perforate the cell membranes on the surface of the parasite and kill them. So the eosinophils are starting to kill parasitic cells. They act against larger parasites. And if someone has a parasitic infection, there is an increase in the number of eosinophils, so that there are more eosinophils to perform this function. Now, the next group of cells involved in the innate immune response are the monocytes. Now, monocytes are large leukocytes. They are large white blood cells, and they circulate in the bloodstream. And they are large cells, and they are phagocytic. But perhaps more importantly than this, monocytes actually migrate into the tissues, and they can patrol within the tissues. They're able to move around using this process of movement called amoeboid movement. They're able to move around in the tissues, and if there's any bacteria or viruses there, they will be chemically attracted to those antigens, to those viruses or bacteria, and they will move towards them, being attracted by the chemicals released from the bacteria or the viruses. So they will actually move towards them, chemotaxis, movement by chemical attraction. But when the monocytes are in the tissues and they enlarge, they become known as macrophages. So a macrophage is a cell in the tissues which is derived from a monocyte. It's kind of a monocyte which is grown up, if you like. So the monocyte circulates in the blood. The monocyte moves into the tissue spaces through the capillary walls. And when the monocyte is in the tissue spaces, it's then called a macrophage. Macro, big, phage, to eat. These are big eaters. And when they start eating bacterial cells, they get even bigger and can become really quite large cells, capable of a large amount of phagocytosis. These are cells with a large appetite. They can eat a lot of bacteria, they can eat a lot of viruses. And also, if there's necrosed body cells, if there's dead body cells after an injury or after an infection, we want to get rid of those, and the macrophages will also phagocytose dead body cells to get rid of it. Because dead body cells, they are a good habitat for bacteria, for infecting bacteria. So if there's necrotic areas of tissues left in, bacteria can get into them, they can live in them, they can act as a bacterial substrate, they provide food for bacteria. And as well as that, healthy living cells cannot migrate across dead cells to bring about tissue healing and regeneration. So we've mentioned the granular sites, particularly thinking about the neutrophils and the eosinophils. We've mentioned the monocytes and the way that they grow up into macrophages. Now the third group of cells involved in the innate immune response are the lymphocytes. Now lymphocytes are divided into large lymphocytes and the small lymphocytes. And the type of lymphocyte involved in the innate immune response is the large lymphocyte. And these are also sometimes referred to as NK cells, natural killer cells. And this is what happens. When a cell is infected by a virus, then that cell allows some of the viral glycoproteins, some of the chemicals which did form part of the virus, to migrate up to the surface of the cell. So the virus is an intracellular parasite. It actually gets right inside the cell, which means it can be rather hard for the immune system to detect it's there. So when a cell is just patrolling by, it won't actually see these viruses because they're inside the cell. But the cells are clever, and when there is a virus there, viral glycoproteins are deposited on the surface of the cell. And of course these viral proteins are not human proteins, they are viral proteins. And the large lymphocytes recognize the presence of this nasty foreign invading material on the surface of the cell. And when the large lymphocytes, the natural killer cells, detect the presence of viral glycoproteins, viral fragments on the surface of the cell, from that they realize that this cell is infected by viruses. And the natural killer cells don't mess about. What they do is they destroy the whole cell. It's a process called cytotoxicity. They are cytotoxic cells. They will kill the cell. And again they release perforins, and these chemicals perforate the cell membrane. This is the body's own cell now, of course. Causes that to blow up, swell, it kills the cell, but it kills the viruses with it. And that means the viruses can't be shed from the cell as they normally would do and go on and invade further cells. So it's a fairly dramatic approach, but you know, it stops the process of the viruses spreading around the body. So if you have a sore throat and you look at the back of your throat, it's all red and inflamed. The reason it's red and inflamed is not because of the inflammation caused by the respiratory virus. Actually, the reason it's red and painful and inflamed is because the body's own natural killer cells have killed off a layer of the body's own cells. And the reason it did that was because these cells are infected with the viral particles. It's a bit like having some enemy terrorists or something in a room, and instead of going in and taking them out one by one, you just chuck in a hand grenade and kill the lot. But of course you kill the room at the same time, you kill the body cell. So natural killer cells, fairly, fairly aggressive, fairly abrupt, don't mess around, but get the job done. And of course over time the throat cells will regenerate and heal, so long term you get rid of the infection, which is what we need to do, because otherwise it would just spread around and cause even more tissue damage. So granular sites, monocytes large lymphocytes, natural killer cells. And I think the last thing to do on this podcast is to talk about the process of phagocytosis. Phag means to eat, or phagocytosis. Phagocytosis is the same, just different pronunciations. But the phage part means to eat, and cytosis means to do with cells. So the process is essentially the same whether it's a neutrophil carrying out the phagocytosis or a macrophage carrying out the phagocytosis. And there's a diagram of this in the White Physiology book on page 75 if you want to look at it. But what happens is that the phagocyte, the phagocytic cell, usually a neutrophil or a phagocyte, detects the presence of the bacteria or viruses chemically, and it, as we've described before, it moves towards it. It moves towards the infecting cell. And then when it gets to it, it keeps on moving round about it until the bacteria form an indentation within the wall of the macrophage, or whatever phagocyte it is. And this keeps on going until the bacteria are in like a little hollow within the phagocyte. And then when the cell membranes of the phagocyte touch on either side, the cell membranes merge, and that means that the bacteria or the viruses or whatever it is are now completely enclosed within the cytoplasm of the phagocyte. And they will be surrounded by a layer of normal cell membrane, because remember, they first came in contact with the cell membrane and they form this indentation. So what you end up with is the bacteria actually inside the cytoplasm of the phagocyte, surrounded by the normal cell membrane of the phagocyte. In other words, the bacteria have been eaten. Now, the next thing that happens is inside these cells there are cell organelles called lysosomes. And these lysosomes contain a digestive enzyme called lysozyme. And these lysosomes move towards the vacuole containing the bacteria, and the membranes of the lysosomes merge with the membrane of the vacuole containing the bacteria, and they essentially become one cavity within the cell, one compartmentalized membrane-bound area within the cell. And what this does is it releases the digestive enzymes of the lysosomes, that is, it releases the lysozyme onto the bacteria, and the lysozyme simply breaks them up, it digests them. It'll digest the proteins into amino acids, it will digest the fats into fatty acids and glycerol, it will digest the carbohydrates into simple sugars. It just breaks them up and digests them. And that's good because it kills the bacterial cell, but also the end products of digestion are simply reabsorbed by the cell and used as a food, and that allows the cell to grow. Any bits that the cell can't digest, it just spits out the other side in the process called exocytosis. It just excretes it from the cell. So phagocytosis ingests and digests foreign invading material, and in doing so kills it. So phagocytes are very useful. The monocytes, the macrophages and the neutrophils capable of the process of phagocytosis, eating, digesting and therefore killing infecting microorganisms.